I left Flagstaff just before 9 that night, my headlights cutting weak, yellow lines into the dark desert stretching toward Kingman. The road was mostly empty, a long ribbon of asphalt flanked by scrub and low hills, nothing but the hum of tires and the occasional distant coyote howl. I was alone, which felt normal at first, but the isolation started to gnaw at me after the first hour. I had been driving for months, solo trips from city to city, but this night felt different. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was the way the horizon seemed to vanish into black before me. My car, an older Honda with more miles than I cared to admit, had been making a grinding noise since I hit the I-40 junction. I'd ignored it, telling myself it was nothing, just wear and tear. The sound had grown gradually, a rough whine beneath the hum of the engine that seemed worse when I pressed the accelerator. At first, I thought it was tires, then brakes, but every time I slowed down or shifted gears, it persisted. I didn't want to stop in the middle of nowhere, so I kept going. I kept telling myself it would hold out until Los Angeles. The radio was barely functional. Static buzzed in the corners of the station, cutting in and out. Occasionally, a song would emerge from the hiss, a line of music so thin and distorted it felt like it was coming from a speaker underwater. I left it on because the noise kept me alert, gave me some illusion of company. My headlights reflected off the asphalt, making the paint lines shimmer faintly, but beyond that, everything was dark. Around 10:45, the fog rolled in. I didn't see it coming, only noticed the air getting thick, cooler, damp against my skin. The beams from my headlights dissolved into a wall of gray that swallowed the road almost immediately. The painted lines disappeared under a pale glow, and my own reflection in the side mirrors seemed ghostly, doubled by the mist. I slowed down instinctively, gripping the wheel tighter, heart pounding. I could hear the grinding noise in the car more sharply now, resonating against the heavy, wet air inside the cabin. Visibility dropped to barely 10 feet in front of me. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to see the edge of the road, the faint rumble strip that might guide me. The desert around me vanished, leaving only a tunnel of gray. The sound of my tires against the asphalt was deafening in contrast to the silence outside. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of everything: wind, insects, the hum of distant traffic. Even my own breathing sounded too loud, shallow, tight. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the fog itself, a trick of the dim yellow light. But it didn't move like fog. It crouched just off the shoulder, in the gravel beyond the white line, a dark silhouette bent low, head tucked and arms folded over knees. My stomach tightened. I swerved instinctively to the left, almost overcorrecting into the lane divider before realizing there was no other car behind me. My headlights illuminated it for a split second. It was humanoid vaguely, but enormous, limbs long and bent strangely. My pulse hammered in my ears. I forced myself to keep driving, glancing into the rearview mirror for signs of movement, but the fog swallowed everything behind me. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to pull over, but there was nowhere safe. The shoulder was narrow, just gravel and low scrub, and the idea of stepping out into that fog felt dangerous. I focused on the road, on the lines, even though they were barely visible, telling myself it was my only control. My heart didn't settle. Every now and then, I thought I saw something at the edge of the headlights again, crouched low, then gone the moment I blinked. The grinding in the car grew louder, more insistent. The tires felt heavy on the asphalt, the car sluggish, as if the fog itself pressed against me. I had to slow down even more, my speed down to 25 miles per hour on a highway that should have allowed 60. My knuckles whitened around the wheel. I forced myself to breathe steadily, focusing on the narrow beam ahead. I kept telling myself it was an animal, or maybe someone walking. Nothing supernatural. I needed logic to keep calm. Minutes stretched. I counted them in my head, listening to the static on the radio. I imagined other drivers, lights far ahead, maybe someone coming back to check the road. Nothing appeared. Only the crouched figure, or figures, at the shoulder, appearing and disappearing like shadows in my peripheral vision. I started to notice details I hadn't before. The fog was not uniform. It swirled and eddied, curling around the scrub and rocks, making shapes where there were none. The figure always seemed to remain at the edge, just out of full sight, never stepping forward, never moving completely. It was patient, watching. I realized I was gripping the wheel too tightly, my arms stiff. I tried to massage my hands, but could barely loosen my grip, afraid of what might happen if I relaxed. My pulse had slowed a little, but adrenaline made my vision sharp, everything hyper-focused. The car shuddered when I hit a slight dip in the road, the grinding momentarily louder, then softer. My headlights revealed small stones on the shoulder, disturbed, like something had been moving along the roadside recently. That was the moment I understood that what I was seeing wasn't just imagination or fog. Something had been there for a while. Something big enough to disturb the ground. I kept driving, telling myself that if I kept moving, I would leave it behind. My eyes burned from staring into the gray void, fog sticking to my eyelashes. The temperature dropped further. My windshield fogged from the inside, forcing me to crack the window slightly, letting in the chilled desert air. My car smelled of damp metal and heated rubber. After what felt like an eternity, a curve in the road revealed the edge of a small gas station, its lights dim and flickering. Relief hit me in a wave, my stomach unclenching slightly. I slowed, pulling into the lot, shaking, breathing hard. The fog seemed thinner here, diffused by the artificial light. I turned off the car, the grinding stopped. Silence fell, almost too heavy. I sat there, headlights cutting weak beams into the empty lot, heart still hammering, trying to convince myself I had imagined the crouched figure. Maybe it had been a deer, maybe a coyote, something that looked wrong in the fog. I stepped out briefly, the cold hitting me immediately, checking the ground. Nothing, just gravel and scattered leaves. I waited a long time before starting again, letting the fog dissipate with the rising wind. The car's grinding noise was gone once I drove slowly into the main highway, the sense of being watched gradually fading. By the time I reached Kingman, the sky had cleared, the road empty but normal, the desert calm. I parked at a motel, heart still racing, and examined my car. There were no scratches, no marks from the roadside, no disturbance at all. I convinced myself it had been the fog and nerves. But even as I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling of those long, crouched limbs beside the road, patient and silent. Something had been there, and it had watched me through the fog. The next morning, I started the drive again, daylight giving the highway a friendly clarity. The fog had vanished completely, replaced by dry, sharp Arizona air and endless miles of desert. I never saw the figure again. I never spoke about it, but whenever I think of Route 66 at night, I remember the way the fog swallowed the world and how it felt to be small and visible, alone in the beam of my headlights. I know now that some stretches of highway are empty in ways that feel alive, and that the desert can watch you without making a sound. I left the lake just as the last hints of light were fading over the water. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and wet grass from the morning rain, and the roads were quiet except for the occasional insect buzzing near the headlights. Dave had fallen asleep in the passenger seat within the first 20 minutes of the drive, curled up against the door like he always did after a long weekend. I didn't mind the silence. I liked driving alone at night, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the feel of the wheel under my hands. But on I-90 that night, something started to feel off almost immediately, though I didn't know it yet. At first, it was just a truck, an old semi, probably from some hauling company I'd never heard of, rolling slowly behind us. Its lights were dim at first, just a distant pair of pinpoints, but as we kept going, it seemed to get closer, moving faster than it should have been able to without changing lanes or position. The road was empty. The line stretched out straight for miles, the occasional curve or hill nothing to slow a truck like that. Yet it kept pace with me like it was reading my speedometer. Every time I adjusted my speed, it adjusted too. Not gradually like a careful driver, but instantly, mirroring my movements with an exactness that made my stomach tighten. I checked the mirrors several times. The truck's headlights were bright and sharp, the kind that cut through the darkness like knives. They weren't the standard white. There was a yellow tint to them, almost harsh, like the bulbs were old and uneven. Every time I glanced back, I could see the cab big and square, metal dented in places, its surface grimy from the road. It was just a truck, nothing impossible about it, yet the way it kept up with me felt deliberate. The road sloped upward slightly as we approached a rise near the state line, and I instinctively pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck matched me immediately, no hesitation. Its engine sound changed subtly with mine, echoing my own movements. My hands tightened on the wheel. I wasn't afraid for my life. I've driven for years, but I was acutely aware that something about this truck was unnerving in a way I couldn't name. The highway was wide, clear, and empty. There was nothing for it to react to, and yet it behaved as though it was aware of me. Dave shifted in his sleep. I glanced over once, just to make sure he was okay, and when I looked back, the truck seemed closer. Closer than it should have been if it had been moving at a normal pace. I swerved slightly to the left lane, giving it more space, and it moved as though pushed by the same invisible hand, following exactly, lights glaring. I could feel the pulse in my chest, my nerves tightening like cords. It was just a truck, I reminded myself. An old semi. That's all. Then it started flashing its lights. Not the blinkers, not a single hazard flash. Just bursts, high beams, low beams, high beams, low beams, patternless, almost aggressive. I had to look away because they burned my eyes in the rearview mirror. It wasn't warning me about something, at least not in any way that made sense. It was more like it was reacting to me. I slowed down slightly, trying to give it space, but every time I did, it accelerated to catch up, almost instantly, its presence behind me as solid as the car I was driving. The rest stop came into view, a small cluster of dim lights and concrete barriers, and I didn't hesitate. I eased off the road and turned in, the asphalt crunching under my tires. I expected the truck to roll past, to continue down the highway like it belonged there, but when I glanced back in the mirror as I slowed, it wasn't there. No lights, no cab, nothing. I eased into a parking space and waited, heart still pounding, staring at the dark stretches of the highway outside the lot. Dave stirred and mumbled in his sleep. I wanted to wake him, wanted someone else to see it, but I didn't. I didn't know what I would say, how I would explain it. I parked at the far end, away from the pumps, and kept my headlights on, scanning the stretch of road that would normally show the truck rolling past. Nothing. I waited for several minutes, counting silently, my hands gripping the steering wheel. When I finally took a deep breath, I realized the semi hadn't returned. It hadn't even slowed at the entrance to the rest stop, and yet it was gone. Just disappeared. We didn't stay long. I didn't want to leave, either, but the longer we stayed, the more I felt the need to put distance between me and that stretch of road. I started the car, pulled back onto the highway, and drove as if I had been chased for hours, though the road was still empty. Dave was awake now, rubbing his eyes and groaning, and I just shook my head at him. No words were needed. The silence returned, the tires on the asphalt, the headlights cutting through the dark. For the rest of the drive to Spokane, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see it again, but it never appeared. Every time I remembered how it had moved, how it had matched me, how the lights had burned into my eyes, I felt a residual tension in my chest. It was just a truck, I kept telling myself. Just a truck. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. But the way it had mirrored my actions so precisely, the timing of every movement, it left an imprint in my mind that I couldn't shake. When we finally reached Spokane, the roads were empty, but I didn't stop. I drove straight through, finally pulling into my driveway in the early morning hours. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the quiet neighborhood made the contrast of that highway feel almost unreal. Dave was asleep again, curled up in the passenger seat, exhausted. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I never saw that truck again. I don't know if it was coincidence, someone following me, or a driver who knew exactly how to time their movements. There was no evidence of anything unusual, nothing concrete to explain the feeling of being mirrored, the flashes of light that hurt my eyes, or the sudden acceleration that felt impossibly fast. I've driven that highway countless times since, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, and I've never encountered anything like it. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes and think back to that night, I can feel it behind me, just out of reach, lights flicking, following my every move. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't impossible. It was a truck, moving like a normal truck, yet somehow it wasn't. And that subtle, uncanny behavior has stayed with me longer than the miles, the empty roads, or the quiet hum of tires on asphalt. It's a simple memory, but it carries a weight, a reminder that sometimes the ordinary can be profoundly unsettling when it behaves just slightly outside expectation. I left the campsite just before midnight, the sky still carrying the faint remnants of moonlight filtered through a thin layer of clouds. The air was damp from the rain that had settled over the Adirondacks the night before, leaving everything slick and glistening. The road back to my apartment in Albany was narrow, 2 lanes at most, flanked by dense trees that rose like dark walls on either side. I had the windows cracked slightly, letting in the smell of wet pine and dirt, and the tires hummed quietly on the asphalt, carrying me forward with a steady rhythm. It had been a long weekend, the kind of weekend that leaves your body tired but your mind restless, and I was ready to get back to a shower, a bed, and some silence. The radio was on low, a habit from solo drives that made the distance feel smaller, less empty. At first, it was just the usual static that comes when you move out of range, a thin hiss that waxed and waned as I turned along winding sections of road. Then, almost imperceptibly, the static sharpened. It wasn't just the white noise anymore. Faintly, underneath the hum, I thought I could hear something like a voice. I turned the volume down, thinking it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the speakers or the interference bouncing off the hills. But the whispering persisted, low and uneven, almost like someone trying to form words and failing. I leaned closer to the radio, adjusting the dial, flipping through stations. Nothing came through. The whispering stopped when I turned the radio completely off. I exhaled slowly and forced myself to focus on the road, telling myself I was tired and jumping at shadows. The road narrowed further, patches of mud spreading from the shoulder into the asphalt where water had washed down from the higher ground. My headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the occasional reflective road sign and the glint of wet leaves. Then I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the road. I braked slightly, my stomach tightening. The figure was waving, a single arm moving slowly, deliberately. I slowed more, trying to see clearly through the dark. My headlights were the only source of light, and they revealed nothing more than a vague silhouette, tall and thin, motionless except for the hand. I didn't stop. I wanted to. I wanted to make sure whoever it was okay, but some instinct pushed me to keep moving. As I drew closer, I blinked, and the figure was gone. The spot it had occupied was empty, the mud slick and smooth under the headlights. My heart hammered. I glanced around, checking the sides of the road, into the shadows beyond the trees. Nothing. Just the dark, just the dripping foliage, and the distant sound of water running over stones somewhere off the road. I kept my foot lightly on the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The radio remained off, and I tried not to think about the whispers. I could still feel the echo of them, a low, murmuring vibration in the back of my mind. My thoughts started racing, filling with what-ifs that I normally would have laughed off during daylight hours. A figure that appears out of nowhere and vanishes instantly. A voice in the radio that isn't there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the headlights, the reflection on the wet road, the tiredness, had all combined to make me see something that wasn't real. It didn't help. I noticed then that the mud at the side of the road looked disturbed, more than it had before. Footprints, I realized with a sudden jolt. Barely visible at first, then clearer in the diffuse light, stretching from where the figure had been. I couldn't see the toes, not even the heel clearly, just impressions that suggested weight, motion. They didn't lead anywhere obvious, vanishing into the forest a few feet in. I slowed again, squinting. My chest tightened, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Nothing moved in the trees. The air was still, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to focus on the road ahead. The trees receded, forming a shallow curve, and I could see a faint glow far in the distance where the road intersected with a larger highway. I told myself that once I got there, I could stop, maybe pull into a gas station, shake off the unease. But the closer I got, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just quiet, it felt like a pressure, a weight pressing in from the trees, the darkness, even the air itself. My hands tensed, knuckles white on the wheel. Every shadow looked like movement. Every glint of wet bark looked like eyes catching the headlights. The whispers returned, not in the radio this time, but in my mind, almost as if I was hearing them in the periphery of my thoughts. Low, staccato, fragments that almost sounded like words. I shook my head. I had to stop thinking about it. I had to drive. But then I saw movement at the shoulder again. Another figure? No, just a trick of the light. Or was it? I slammed on the brakes, and the tires squealed against the wet asphalt. I leaned forward, straining, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shape dissipated, blending into the darkness like smoke. I picked up speed again, gripping the wheel until my knuckles hurt. The adrenaline had my pulse racing, and I realized my breathing was shallow and quick. The mud on the side of the road was gone now, smooth and unbroken, like the footprints had never existed. I kept telling myself that I had imagined it all, every bit. I tried to concentrate on the sound of the tires rolling over the asphalt, on the lines of the road fading past. Still, the sense of being watched didn't leave me, the feeling that something was just beyond the reach of the headlights. Eventually, the trees thinned, and the road opened into a wider, better-lit stretch. I could see the faint orange glow of street lamps and the reflective paint of a road sign ahead. My pulse finally slowed a little, and I allowed myself a small, shaking laugh at how worked up I had gotten. The rest of the drive was uneventful. I stayed on the main highway, keeping my eyes on the road and off the shoulders, ignoring every noise from the forest, every thought about the whispers or the footprints. I reached my apartment around 3:30 a.m., pulling into the lot with my hands still trembling on the wheel. I parked, sat there for a moment, and let the quiet of the interior settle over me, normal and predictable. I never saw the figure again. I never heard the whispers return. I went back to that road another time during daylight, driving slowly to see if I could make sense of what had happened. The mud was just mud, the trees were just trees, and the air was just air. I never found any sign of footprints, never anything unusual at all. I still don't know exactly what I saw, if it was fatigue, tricks of the headlights, or some part of my mind misfiring in the dark. But the sense of being watched, the fleeting shape, and the sudden, inexplicable footprints are something I carry with me whenever I drive that way at night. A quiet reminder that sometimes the road itself can feel alive, and sometimes the mind can catch glimpses of things that aren't meant to be seen. I was driving along Highway 93 in Nevada at nearly 2 in the morning, heading south toward Arizona after a delayed flight that had left me restless and tense. The roads were empty, save for the occasional glint of reflective paint lines, and the desert stretched on both sides in indistinct shadows, the silhouettes of mesquite and sparse juniper breaking up the flat darkness. The sky was black and clear, and the stars were bright enough to feel like they were pressing down, just out of reach, while the headlights of my car carved sharp rectangles of visibility ahead. I was tired, my eyes burning from a long day of travel, and my body ached from sitting in cramped airplane seats for hours. I had relied on my GPS the whole way, trusting it to keep me on the main highway, but a sudden recalculation threw me onto a narrow service road I had never seen before, the lines on the screen flashing urgently, almost aggressively in the dark. At first, I assumed it was just a detour. The road itself was rougher than the main highway, with patches of gravel and sand pushing at the tires. The lines of the highway disappeared completely after a short distance, and the white reflective markers were replaced by crude, chipped wooden posts. It felt isolated immediately, and the kind of isolation that sets your nerves on edge. Every mile I drove, the desert seemed to stretch wider, emptier, and I felt that familiar mix of awe and unease that comes from being surrounded by a landscape that could swallow you whole. I had been driving for maybe 15 minutes when I noticed shapes up ahead. At first, I thought they were old barrels, maybe debris from some construction project. Then I realized they had been deliberately arranged across the road, a makeshift blockade made of orange barrels, faded warning signs, and what looked like a piece of plywood laid across the gravel. The headlights caught the edges of footprints in the dirt between the barrels, single, wide, human footprints. I slowed instinctively, my heart picking up a rhythm that matched the thump in my temples, and the car in front of me, if there had been one, had vanished. The road was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the faint wind that whispered over the desert floor. I killed the engine to get a closer look. The barrels seemed aged, some dented, some almost camouflaged with the color of the sand, but the footprints were fresh. The dirt was loose, and the impressions were clear, as if someone had walked through them only moments before. I shifted in the seat, reaching to restart the car, and it turned over sluggishly, coughing but not fully catching. My stomach clenched. I tried again. Nothing. The desert night suddenly felt much closer, the shadows more immediate. The quiet was too loud. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footfalls along the shoulder, soft at first, then faster, heavier. Someone was moving quickly behind the car, the gravel crunching under their steps. My pulse spiked, adrenaline flooding my system, and I hit the ignition again. The engine caught this time, the growl of the motor filling the silence, and I slammed the car into gear. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard it ached. The footfalls continued, keeping pace with the car. I dared a glance in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the dark outline of the desert, but I could feel the presence, the way the sound bounced between the canyon walls, following me. I accelerated, eyes fixed on the road ahead, heart hammering so loudly I could almost hear it over the engine. Every instinct screamed to keep going, to not stop for anything, and yet the image of the footprints lingered, impossibly clear in my mind. The barrels and signs that had blocked my way were gone before I reached the end of the service road, as if they had never existed. The desert reclaimed the gravel, and the faint markers of the road dissolved into sand. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the feeling that I had been followed, that something was watching me the whole time. Back on the main highway, I slowed slightly, though not enough to ease the tension. The lights of distant towns were still hours away, mere flickers against the dark horizon. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and my knuckles were white from gripping it too tightly. I checked the rearview mirror again, and saw only the empty highway, stretching out like a black ribbon toward Arizona. The sense of relief that should have come with returning to the main road was muted by the lingering dread in my chest. The desert night had changed, the way the wind pressed through the car vents, and the way shadows seemed to move along the roadside. I couldn't tell how long I had been driving before I stopped at a pullout near a faint cluster of lights in the distance. My body trembled with exhaustion, and I sat there for what felt like an hour, taking in the silence. The engine ticked as it cooled, and the smell of desert dust clung to the upholstery. The strange encounter with the roadblock, the footprints, and the footfalls behind the car played over and over in my head. It was almost too real, too physical, the sensation of someone, or something, running behind me as I struggled to get the engine started. Eventually, I started the car again, this time driving more cautiously but still alert, scanning the shoulders and horizon for anything that might appear. The rest of the drive to the Arizona border was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the memory of that empty service road. Every bend, every patch of loose gravel, brought back the sensation of being trapped in that narrow corridor between barrels and footprints, powerless for a moment as the engine refused to turn over. I kept replaying the sound of the footsteps, the impossibly clear impressions in the dirt, the way the roadblock had vanished the moment I forced the car to move again. By the time I crossed into Arizona, the sky was beginning to lighten with the faint glow of dawn. I pulled off at a gas station, shaking hands, fumbling with the pump handle. I had to fill up, had to drink water, had to tell myself I was safe. The desert had returned to ordinary emptiness in the morning light, the road quiet and uneventful, the long, isolated highway stretching ahead as if the night had never existed. Even now, years later, I remember the details, the barrels, the plywood, the footprints, and the impossibly patient sound of something moving behind me in the dark. The encounter was entirely plausible, entirely real, and entirely terrifying because there was no explanation, no supernatural element to dismiss. Just isolation, a broken GPS, a deserted road, and the raw, animal fear that comes from realizing how alone you are in the world. The memory is still vivid, and the sense of helplessness lingers, a reminder of how fragile a night in the middle of nowhere can feel. I was driving through Tennessee's Appalachian backroads around 1 a.m, trying to shave a little time off the trip. My GPS had cut out hours earlier, and I knew the main highway would take longer. I remembered a turn I'd taken years ago on an old map, a shortcut through the hills and hollows. The sky was clouded, the moon behind thin gray layers, and the headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness. There was no traffic, no lights, nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The road started narrow, 2 lanes at first, but after a few miles it became tight, winding between steep banks and dense trees. I slowed for curves I couldn't see around, following the faded white lines. Occasionally, a branch would scratch the side of the car, and the tires crunched over gravel patches where the pavement had worn thin. It smelled damp, like wet earth and rotting leaves. The further I drove, the more it felt like the road was swallowing me, the trees pressing closer, shadows stretching across the asphalt. After 20 minutes, the pavement simply ended. There was no warning, no sign, nothing to indicate that the road was over. In front of me, mud tracks led into the forest, rutted by some kind of heavy vehicle. I hesitated, but I figured I could follow the tracks until I found the road again. I shifted to 4-wheel drive and moved forward slowly. Mud splattered the undercarriage, my tires slipped once or twice. The forest around me was almost silent, except for the faint sound of my own engine and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The headlights reflected off wet leaves, creating shifting shapes and patterns in the darkness. I had been in that mud for maybe 5 minutes when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a shadow, but the shape was too tall, too wide, too deliberate. I froze. The figure was massive, easily 8 feet or more, with broad shoulders that seemed slightly hunched. Its shape was humanoid, though the proportions were wrong. The head was low, almost blending into the shoulders, and the arms were long, hanging nearly to the knees. I could not make out any facial features, but the way it stood was deliberate, as if it was waiting or watching. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded across the mud, tires spinning. I didn't stop in time. The front wheels dug into the ditch on the side of the road, and the car tilted sharply, engine racing. Heart pounding, I sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the figure. I kept expecting it to move, to step forward, but it didn't. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably less than a minute, it shifted slightly, and then disappeared completely into the trees. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to get out, but I also didn't want to draw attention to myself. The forest was still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the sound of the mud settling around my tires. I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel, every sense on edge. I tried to reason through what I had seen. Could it have been someone hiding, someone playing a trick? Maybe a hunter or someone living off the grid. None of it explained the size, the proportions. After nearly an hour, I realized I had to move. I started the car, keeping the engine low and the lights dim. I inched backward out of the ditch, careful not to spin. The mud made every movement tentative. When I felt steady, I slowly retraced my path along the tracks, keeping an eye on the tree line. Nothing moved, nothing followed. Every so often, a branch would snap underfoot, and I'd flinch, expecting the figure to reappear. The tracks eventually led me back to the paved road. I pulled over as soon as I could, parked, and took a few deep breaths. My hands were slick with sweat, and my chest was tight. I turned off the engine and sat in silence. For a long time, I didn't move. The road was empty, quiet except for the wind brushing through the trees. I looked back into the forest and tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, that the shadows and my exhaustion had warped perception. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't normal. Eventually, I drove again, slower this time, keeping to the main highway. My headlights scanned the roadside constantly, and every movement in the trees made me flinch. It was nearly dawn by the time I reached a small town, a gas station with flickering lights. I parked, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat staring at the road I had come from. Even in daylight, I remembered the figure. The weight of it, the way it had seemed aware of me, the way it had disappeared without a sound. I never saw it again, and I avoided that back road entirely after that night. I told a friend about it years later, trying to frame it as a shadow or a deer, anything mundane, but the truth is I never had an explanation. I can only assume it was a person or an animal larger than anything I'd ever seen, using the cover of darkness and the forest to remain hidden. Even now, years later, I remember the silence before it appeared, the smell of wet leaves and mud, the cold, the way the headlights caught the shape for a split second. It wasn't supernatural. It was something entirely real, something I could have run into, something I hope I never encounter again. The lesson is simple and permanent. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking, especially when the road disappears, the night is deep, and the forest around you is too quiet. I learned to respect the unknown boundaries of these roads. Every curve, every ditch, every dark patch of forest is a potential trap if you aren't prepared. I never took that shortcut again, and I never drive those back roads at night. Even today, if I see mud tracks leading into the forest on an abandoned road, I turn around. Some things are better left unseen. The memory of that figure, standing silent, immovable, watching me slide into the ditch, is something I carry every time I drive through the Appalachians. It's a quiet terror, a reminder of how small and exposed you are on a dark road with no one around. I can't explain it, but I know it was there, and I know how close I came to being part of that darkness. It was the wrong turn, and I paid attention to it for the rest of my life. I was driving home late one September night in 2005, taking US 287 through a stretch of Colorado I barely knew. It was the kind of road that could swallow you whole if you weren't paying attention. I had spent the evening with my sister in Fort Collins, and the night had gone on longer than I expected. The sky was clear, the moon low, and the air carried a sharp bite that only Colorado nights seem to have when summer slides fully into fall. My car's headlights cut a clean path through the darkness, the yellow glow pooling on the asphalt as the trees on either side closed in. I remember feeling a rare kind of solitude, the kind that hums under your skin when you're alone in the mountains. I had been driving for maybe 20 minutes past the last small town when I saw the first one, a single point of light hovering just above the tree line on my right. I thought maybe it was a lantern someone had let loose in a backyard. the kind they release at weddings or parties. It was soft, amber, not blinding like a streetlight, and it moved. Not falling, not swaying in the wind, but moving deliberately along the line of trees. I blinked and adjusted my rearview mirror, but the lantern stayed where it was. My first thought was that I had imagined it, a trick of tired eyes, the streetlights behind me bending through the car window. Then I saw another, and another. They weren't scattered, they were lined up, evenly spaced, like someone had hung them along the edge of the forest. They moved with me. I slowed down slightly, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The air had gone cooler in a rush, and the wind through my open window carried the smell of dry pine and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. When I slowed, the lights didn't drift away as I expected. They seemed to gather closer, keeping pace with the car. Panic set in slowly at first, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your hands slick on the steering wheel. I glanced around for other cars. Nothing. Just me and the dark road, and the line of lights that didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe someone had tied lanterns to balloons and set them loose, or maybe it was some weird hunting setup with portable lights. But everything about the movement felt intentional. Too precise, too coordinated. I increased speed, but the lanterns mirrored me, drifting forward along the tree line, always keeping the same distance. There was no sound, nothing at all except the hum of my engine and the wind against the glass. I watched them out of the corner of my eye, noticing shapes moving just beyond the light. I couldn't make out details at first, but the silhouettes were long and low, some roughly quadrupedal, some upright. Not human, not anything I could identify, but their movement had a certain rhythm, a stalking patience that made my chest tighten. The thought that I was being watched crept up on me like frost along my skin. The road curved sharply around a ridge, and I braked lightly to keep control. The lanterns followed, drifting around the bend in a slow, almost cautious line. I forced myself to breathe, rationalizing that it had to be some kind of local prank or hunter's lights. That made sense. Hunters with powerful night lights. That could explain the shapes too, deer or elk moving in the woods. But even that explanation felt flimsy. The shapes never bolted, never scattered. They moved with a patient coordination that no animal I knew of could maintain when confronted with a speeding car. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to avoid looking too long at the lights, but it was impossible. They seemed to anticipate my movements, sliding along the tree line in perfect synchrony. I noticed that the spacing between them would shift slightly when I changed lanes or slowed, almost as if they were studying me. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, and I realized my heart had been racing for longer than I noticed. Sweat prickled along my neck. The road stretched out in a straight line ahead, then dipped and rose again, each hill revealing the same line of lanterns gliding along the trees as if suspended on invisible tracks. I hit a patch of downhill at full speed, tires humming against the asphalt. The lanterns didn't accelerate, they just floated, deliberate and slow, refusing to break the rhythm I couldn't understand. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lanterns seemed closer now, but still behind the trees. My headlights caught glimpses of them through gaps in the branches, little amber sparks glowing in the dark forest. For a second, one of the shapes stepped out into a patch of open ground. I saw a form low to the ground, long and narrow, like a dog or a coyote, but too tall and too still. It froze when my light hit it, then disappeared. The sight felt unnatural. I couldn't explain it, and it gnawed at the sense of safety I had carried into the car that night. I pressed the accelerator harder, hoping distance would break the spell. The road curved again, and the lights lagged slightly, then snapped back into alignment along the tree line. I didn't take a single glance behind me for at least 5 miles. My car's tires sounded like thunder in the quiet night, my chest heaving with tension, every muscle in my body tense. I had driven countless late-night hours before, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever followed me with such deliberate attention. Finally, the road began to descend toward a section I recognized from maps I had seen during the day. Small clusters of houses appeared along the side, porch lights glowing in the distance. I slowed cautiously, eyes flicking to the tree line one last time. The lanterns had stopped moving, as if the trees themselves had swallowed them. They didn't vanish instantly, they stayed, dim and still, just behind the edge of the forest. I drove past, my heart finally starting to slow, every instinct screaming at me to not stop, to keep moving until the lights were nothing but memory. By the time I reached my sister's town, it was almost midnight. I parked at a gas station near the highway exit, shaking more from the tension than the cold. I called her to let her know I was okay. though I sounded ragged and unnatural. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, of exhaustion, of the mind playing on the isolation of the mountains. And yet, the next day, I found myself scanning the treeline whenever I drove anywhere near that stretch of highway. The shapes, the lanterns, they felt like a memory that didn't belong entirely to sleep or imagination. Weeks later, I would tell myself I must have been seeing things. Lanterns released by campers, hunters' flashlights, animals silhouetted against the amber glow. Rational explanations, and yet I never saw another one. And I never drove that section of US 287 at night again. It was the combination of stillness and movement, the patient follow, the deliberate pace. It left an imprint I couldn't shake. Even now, 20 years later, when I drive long stretches of highway through remote forests, I remember the line of lanterns moving along the treeline, and I feel that same tightening in my chest, the echo of a night that was real enough to make me question what real really means. It was just past midnight on Halloween in 2016, and I was driving back from a friend's party somewhere between Pittsburgh and Morgantown. The roads were mostly empty, a faint glow from distant town lights spilling into the sky, but the stretches between exits were dark, lined with thick trees that seemed to press close to the asphalt. The party had been loud and crowded, and by the time I left, my friends had passed out in the back of the car, sprawled across the seats. I was tired, my mind still buzzing slightly from the drinks and the music, but I felt fine to drive, so I took the wheel, determined to get home. The highway was smooth, the kind that seemed endless when you were driving alone at night. I remember the rhythmic hum of the tires over the asphalt, the way the car's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the dark. I had my phone on the dash, music playing softly through the speakers, something mellow to keep me alert. My eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, a habit I had, checking the road behind me, the lights of distant cars, the occasional truck. It was then I noticed it, a figure in the backseat. At first I thought it was one of my friends, shifting in their sleep. But when I glanced more carefully, the contours didn't match anyone I knew. The shape was upright, not slumped or leaning as my friends were, and it had the strange stillness that didn't belong to someone asleep. It was too dark to see any features clearly, just a silhouette, a human-like form that seemed to watch me through the mirror. My stomach dropped. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks, that maybe the low light and my fatigue were conjuring shapes from the shadows. But the shape stayed there, still, like it was waiting for me to notice. I tried to tell myself it was one of my friends sitting up, groaning or stretching in their sleep, but the way it sat was too deliberate, too tense. I could feel the weight of it without even looking directly. The sense of being watched was almost physical, a pressure at the back of my neck that made my hands grip the wheel tighter. I told myself to calm down, to keep driving. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe it was the way the light hit the empty seat behind me. I even laughed at myself quietly, trying to shake it off, glancing again at the mirror. The figure didn't move. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel them, a presence that seemed fixed on me. My pulse started to quicken. I kept my speed steady, the road stretching endlessly ahead, headlights catching occasional tree trunks and road signs. I tried adjusting the mirror, thinking a different angle might make it disappear. Nothing changed. The silhouette remained there, unmoving, almost solid in its stillness. My hands were trembling slightly on the wheel, and I realized I hadn't noticed the last few miles passing. The next exit came up faster than I expected, a dimly lit ramp that curved sharply off the highway. Without thinking, I swerved toward it, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder as I slowed down. My heart was hammering. I turned off the highway, the car now on a quiet, narrow road lined with trees, the darkness even thicker here, the headlights barely penetrating the branches. I drove a few hundred feet, then pulled over completely, coming to a stop against the shoulder. My hands shook as I put the car in park, the engine idling softly. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, staring at the rearview mirror, expecting the figure to move, to shift, to reveal something terrifying. But when I looked again, the back seat was empty. Completely empty. My friends were still passed out, sprawled across the seats, their faces calm in sleep, but there was no one else there. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. My eyes darted around the back seat, the corners of the car, the windows. Nothing. No shadow, no trace of movement. I got out of the car slowly, stepping onto the cold asphalt, the night air crisp against my skin. I circled the vehicle, peering inside from every angle, shining my phone's flashlight into the corners and under the seats. Nothing. No one had been there. The quiet of the night was total, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every rustle of leaves, every distant sound. I leaned against the hood, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. My mind was spinning, replaying what I had just seen over and over, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe my eyes had caught a trick of the light. Maybe the angle of the mirror had made a shape from the shadows that wasn't really there. Eventually, I got back in the car, keeping the doors locked this time, and drove the rest of the way home with my eyes darting constantly to the mirror. I kept checking the back seat, expecting the figure to appear again, expecting some explanation that would make sense, but it didn't. By the time I reached my driveway, I was exhausted, my body still tense from the adrenaline. I parked the car, cut the engine, and sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the night, a combination of fatigue and imagination. The next morning, I told my friends what had happened. They laughed it off, said I must have been seeing things, that I was probably half asleep or too keyed up from the party. They didn't take it seriously, and I couldn't blame them. It sounded ridiculous when I said it out loud. I didn't mention the sense of being watched, the weight of it pressing down, because that part felt impossible to explain. Even now, thinking back on it, I can still remember the shape, the way it sat there in the back seat, completely still, watching. I can remember the sharp turn off the highway, the way the quiet seemed heavier after that, the way the night felt like it was holding its breath. I never saw anything like it again, and no one else ever confirmed it. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And every time I drive late at night, I can't help but glance at the rearview mirror, just in case, just to make sure the back seat is empty. The thing that made it so real wasn't that it moved or that it made a sound. It was the way it existed without needing to do anything. The presence was enough. And the fact that when I pulled over and checked, the seat was empty, that only confirmed that whatever it had been, it wasn't meant to be explained. It wasn't supernatural, not in any way that anyone could name. It was simply there for that brief moment, solid, human-like, and gone before I could understand it. The memory lingers, precise and vivid, the most unsettling drive I've ever had. It was just past 3 in the morning in August, and the highway ahead of us seemed to stretch on forever, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through dense northern Maine forest. My friends and I had been driving all night, heading toward the border, chasing the faint possibility of crossing into Canada before sunrise. We were tired, the air conditioner weak in our old sedan, and the radio barely audible through the hum of the engine. The road was almost empty, except for the occasional set of headlights in the distance, and the trees pressed close on either side, tall pines and maples that made the highway feel narrow despite its 2 lanes. The smell of wet earth lingered from a light rain earlier in the evening, and it clung to the car like a faint residue of the forest itself. Up ahead, a bus appeared, stopped in the middle of the lane, its hazard lights blinking weakly. It was strange to see such a large vehicle abandoned this far out, miles from any sign of civilization. We slowed and pulled behind it, cutting the engine once we had a clear view. My friends groaned but stepped out, stretching and looking over the scene. The bus was old, yellowed in the lights of our headlights, and the door swung loosely, clanging in the wind. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, head down, hands trembling. I could see him muttering to himself, words swallowed by the distance, but the tone of his voice was sharp, almost urgent. He kept glancing at the tree line, shifting his eyes rapidly, as if expecting something to emerge at any second. We approached cautiously. The air had that strange, tense quality where every rustle and snap sounded amplified. A small branch broke underfoot, and the driver jerked his head toward it, eyes wide, teeth clenched, still muttering. I tried to call for roadside assistance on my phone, but the signal was almost non-existent, a single bar that flickered on and off as if the trees themselves were draining the signal. One of my friends tried anyway, tapping the screen over and over, frustration written across his face. Every few moments, there was a sudden crack of branches, soft at first, then heavier, like someone, or something, was walking in the underbrush. The driver's muttering grew frantic. His eyes darted past us, scanning the darkness beyond the headlights. Then he slammed the door, and in a movement that was almost frantic, he started the bus. He didn't hesitate or look back. The engine roared, and he shot forward, tires squealing against the asphalt, leaving us frozen in place. The hazard lights of the bus disappeared into the distance in a cloud of diesel smoke. The forest closed around us immediately. The silence that followed was thick, and every small noise seemed magnified. I could hear the wind moving through the leaves, the occasional drip of water from branches, but under it all was something heavier, deliberate. A snap of a branch, then another, then several at once, surrounding the bus. My friends and I froze, hearts hammering. We climbed back into the car, locking the doors, rolling up the windows, but the sound didn't stop. There was breathing, or what could have been breathing, just outside, shallow and heavy, mixed with the snapping of small branches, the occasional scrape against the side of the bus. We stayed still, listening. The sound seemed to move around us, from one side of the car to the other, circling slowly, methodically. Every time one of us tried to peer out a window, the noise shifted, as if reacting to our movement. The forest seemed alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I could see shadows moving at the edges of the headlights, brief, indistinct, human-shaped, but too large to be deer or anything normal. I didn't speak. Nobody spoke. Talking felt dangerous. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of movement outside became a rhythm, branches snapping in a sequence, a heavy dragging step every few seconds, a breath so close it could have been pressed against the glass. My hands were slick with sweat, gripping the steering wheel despite not moving. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the highway was empty, dark, and unfamiliar. Driving meant exposing ourselves to whatever was circling. Staying put meant listening. Eventually, the sounds slowed, or we stopped noticing them, swallowed by exhaustion and fear. My friends leaned against the seats, eyes wide, faces pale. I kept the engine running low, knowing we had to move eventually, but hesitant to open the door. Our phones were still useless, maps on the screen just showing a tiny red dot in a void of forest. We tried to measure the distance to the next town, but it felt meaningless out here. The trees closed in, the road straightened into a narrow tunnel of black, and the bus, now miles ahead, was nothing more than a memory and a faint smell of diesel. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became irrelevant. We finally decided we had to move. Slowly, cautiously, we drove forward, windows up, lights low, scanning for anything in the trees. The snapping branches faded, replaced by the occasional distant owl or the whisper of wind. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape flitting across the shoulder, but nothing solid enough to identify. The tension never left, not for a second. Every bump in the road, every rock or fallen branch made our hearts jump. Eventually, the faint glow of lights appeared ahead. A small rest stop, closed but illuminated by a single street lamp. We parked, letting the car idle, and stepped out carefully, scanning the surrounding woods. There was nothing. No shadows, no sounds other than the distant forest and our own breathing. We moved toward the building, found a payphone still intact, and called for help. The operator listened, patience in her voice, and promised to send a tow truck and highway patrol. While we waited, we stayed inside the car, lights off, doors locked. The rest stop felt like civilization, even if it was empty and silent. Eventually, headlights appeared on the highway, growing brighter, and a truck pulled up alongside us. The driver leaned out, waved, and we followed him slowly back toward a small town, everything still tense, every shadow in the trees now a potential threat. By the time we reached a gas station with actual people and phones, the sun was starting to rise. The dark forest of northern Maine finally looked like what it was. Ordinary trees, quiet now in the early morning light. We were shaking, exhausted but safe. We watched the highway behind us stretch into the distance, empty and silent, and the bus never appeared again. The memory of it, the driver's panic, and the sounds circling the bus stayed with us long after, a reminder of how small and exposed we were in that stretch of forest. The isolation, the unknown, and the raw fear had made hours feel like days, and yet, in the light of day, we finally understood that surviving the night had been the only goal. Everything else was secondary. We left that stretch of highway behind, cautious and quiet, our road trip continuing, but forever marked by those hours stranded in the dark, surrounded by the unknown. I left work later than usual that evening, the kind of November day that feels gray and heavy even before the sun starts to slip behind the mountains. The Blue Ridge Parkway stretched ahead of me, slick from a rain that had come and gone in fits during the afternoon. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and cold asphalt. I hadn't planned to drive far, just a slow, scenic route to unwind after sitting at a desk all day. The trees on either side of the road were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a sky the color of old steel. I had my windows cracked a little, letting in the chill that promised the coming winter, and I was glad for it. The day's heat was still clinging to the car in patches, fading as I moved northward. The highway was almost empty. A few headlights flickered in the distance, but for the most part it was just me and the endless ribbon of wet pavement winding through the mountains. I was driving carefully, feeling the tires slide slightly on the rain-slick surface, enjoying the quiet hum of the engine. Somewhere ahead, the last rays of sun filtered through low clouds, painting streaks of orange and pink against the dark green of the pines. I had just started to relax when I saw it, a silhouette near the edge of the road. It was dark against the gray light, and for a split second I thought it was a deer. I slammed on the brakes before I even fully realized it, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. The figure vanished. I mean completely, gone, as if it had never been there. My pulse jumped, and I blinked, convinced I was seeing things, but the wet pavement reflected the sky, the trees, and the faint yellow of the road lines, and nothing else. I eased the car forward, trying to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light, a reflection, maybe another vehicle just beyond the curve. Then I saw more shadows. At first, I thought they were deer too, but they didn't move like any deer I had ever seen. They were larger, far taller than any animal I knew to be in the area, and they moved with a speed and fluidity that was wrong. Too fast for something with 4 legs, darting through the trees and appearing alongside the road in an instant. I could feel them before I could see them, their movement translating into an uneasy energy along the edges of the forest, a sense that something big was pacing me just out of sight. Every time I turned my head to look, they were gone, but the feeling never left. I floored it. The tires squealed, water spraying up from the sides of the car, and the engine roared in protest. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my heart hammered in my chest. The shadows stayed just at the periphery of my vision, sometimes catching the light of my headlights for a fraction of a second, enough to make me see the height, the mass, the impossible speed at which they moved. I tried not to look directly, afraid that if I did I might see too much, might have to confront something I couldn't explain. The road twisted, uphill then down, the mountains shifting and folding in the dim light. I passed over a narrow bridge, the water beneath it black and smooth, reflecting the last glow of the sky. I thought about stopping, pulling over, but every instinct screamed not to. I was alone miles from the nearest town, and something was moving just outside the cone of my headlights. There was no sound, no rustling leaves, nothing that could give away the speed of what I was seeing. Just glimpses of dark, elongated shapes vanishing into the treeline, always appearing ahead or alongside me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a herd of elk, maybe bears running, maybe shadows of trees in the fading light. But nothing in my memory fit the shapes I had seen. Too tall, too fast, too coordinated in the way they stayed at the edges of the road. My stomach twisted with a combination of adrenaline and disbelief. The headlights bounced off the wet asphalt, casting reflections that made the shapes appear even closer, even more sinister. Every mile felt stretched, elongated. I counted the curves, the bends in the road, the occasional faint glow of distant towns, anything to keep myself tethered to reality. At one point, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw movement there too, but the mirror only reflected the dark of the forest, empty except for the shimmer of my own brake lights. My breathing had gone shallow fast, and I found myself gripping the seat belt, my knuckles white. The world had narrowed to the car, the wet road, and the shapes at the edges of the trees that seemed to follow my every turn. After what felt like an eternity, I crested a hill and saw the lights of a town in the distance. Relief surged through me, almost overwhelming in its intensity. I kept my foot down, ignoring the burning in my leg, ignoring the way the tires screamed over small puddles, until the first streetlights appeared, glowing against the foggy dusk. The shapes did not appear again. I slowed gradually, shaking, trying to convince myself I was not imagining what I had just seen. I stopped in a parking lot just inside the town limits, wet and trembling, and sat with the engine running. The headlights illuminated parked cars, the occasional pedestrian walking a dog, and the steady, ordinary rhythm of a small town evening. Everything was normal. Nothing moved in the shadows, nothing shifted outside my view. My pulse finally slowed, and the adrenaline ebbed, leaving a cold exhaustion behind. I thought about what I had seen. Shadows, too fast, too tall, too deliberate to be deer or anything ordinary. But there were no claw marks, no footprints, no signs that anything had actually crossed the road. The forest looked undisturbed, and the wet leaves reflected only the streetlights. It had been real, I told myself, the fear, the chase, the impossible movement, but it had been quiet, patient, and precise. Something had been pacing me, testing me, and then it had let me go once I reached the edge of the town. I started the car again, heading toward my motel on the far side of town, still shaking slightly, eyes scanning every darkened corner. The road was dry now, or at least no longer wet enough to make me slip. I forced my breathing into something steady and even, replaying the drive in my mind, trying to find a rational explanation. None fit. No animal, no deer, no bear could have moved like that. Yet I had not imagined it, I could not have. The rest of the drive was quiet. The town lights disappeared behind me, replaced by the dark stretch of the parkway that led to my motel. I kept my speed moderate, eyes focused on the road, listening to the tires hum over the asphalt, feeling the steady weight of the car beneath me. The shadows did not return. The forest seemed ordinary again, nothing moving faster than a deer or a fox, nothing tall enough to worry about. I parked at the motel and sat for a long time before turning off the engine. I did not sleep well that night, replaying the shapes, the speed, the eerie way they had kept pace without making a sound. In the morning, the parkway seemed benign, ordinary, washed in pale sunlight and crisp November air. The rain had left a clean smell behind, and the leaves glittered as if nothing had happened. I never saw anything like it again. The deer silhouette that vanished, the taller shapes that moved impossibly fast. It remained the strangest drive I have ever taken. I never tried to return that way at dusk. I still drive the parkway occasionally, but always during the day, always aware that something could have been moving just out of sight, pacing silently, letting me think I was alone until I wasn't. The memory stays with me, a quiet reminder that even ordinary roads can hold moments that feel impossibly large, fast, and alive. I left the Christmas party later than I had intended, the roads already slick with ice from an early winter storm that had started late in the evening. The town was small, and the drive back to my parents' place took me through stretches of highway that cut through open plains and thick pockets of pine forest. At 2 a.m., the highway was almost completely empty. Snow clung to the trees along the shoulders, and the icy sheen on the asphalt reflected my headlights in sharp, blinding streaks. I could see the occasional road sign glinting in the beams, the letters distorted by the frost on the metal. My car moved cautiously, tires crunching against patches of frozen slush as I followed the curves of the road, aware that a single misjudgment could send me spinning into the ditch or worse. At first, everything was as I expected. The cold had made the air clear and almost brittle, and the headlights revealed nothing but the dim outlines of trees and the reflective strips along the guardrails. Then, about 10 miles out of town, I noticed something odd up ahead. At first, I thought I had glimpsed the taillights of a car stopped in my lane, the kind of thing that makes you instinctively lift your foot off the accelerator and glance in the rearview mirror. I slowed, keeping a cautious distance, but as I drew closer, there was nothing. No vehicle, no figure, nothing but the black stretch of road and the occasional glimmer of ice. I shook my head, telling myself it was the reflection from the icy patches, my own tired eyes playing tricks. I adjusted my focus and kept driving, but the unease settled in deeper. A few minutes later, I noticed movement in the headlights. Another car seemed to be traveling in the lane ahead, but it was strange. The headlights were exactly the same shape and angle as mine. At first, I thought maybe another driver had come up behind me, but the road had been empty for miles. Then it hit me. The car in front wasn't moving independently. It mirrored me perfectly. Every slight shift in my speed was copied. Every turn I made, the other car made in the same way. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. I swerved slightly within my lane to test the movement. The reflection adjusted immediately. I slowed, it slowed. I accelerated, and it accelerated. It was impossible. There was no one else on this road. No other vehicles had been visible for the last 15 minutes. Yet this thing, this image, replicated me perfectly. The first instinct was panic, but my mind kept trying to rationalize. Maybe it was ice reflecting the road ahead in some strange way. Maybe the trees, the snow, the headlights all aligning to form a trick of light. I stared at it, willing myself to see the truth, but the more I looked, the more precise it became. It matched my exact position, exact speed, exact distance. The highway stretched ahead in straight lines interrupted by gentle curves. On each curve, the other car adjusted as if it had eyes, perfectly anticipating each bend before I reached it. My pulse quickened. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. I told myself I was imagining it, that the ice and the snow were bending light in a way I had never noticed before, that the long hours, the driving, and the cold were fraying my perception. But my rationalizations fell away as the minutes dragged on. It continued to mirror me with chilling precision. I reached for the radio, flipping through stations, hoping for some noise to break the tension. Static and a few faint songs came and went. I couldn't focus on them, could barely hear them over the sound of my own breathing, which had grown rapid and shallow. My eyes darted between the road, the mirrors, the headlights reflecting off the ice, and that image. I thought about pulling over, but there was nowhere safe. The shoulders were buried in snow, the ditch hard and jagged with ice. I couldn't stop. When a slight rise in the road came, I noticed something more unsettling. The reflected car in front of me didn't just mimic speed and direction. It seemed aware of the shadows along the road. A deer crossing sign glinted under the headlights, and for a moment, I expected to see a deer burst out from the treeline. Nothing came, yet the mirrored car slowed slightly before the rise, as if preparing, as if anticipating. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I hit the first exit I recognized, the one leading back toward town. I steered onto the ramp, glancing in the rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I saw the mirrored car turn with me. Then it vanished. The rest of the way back, every reflective surface, other cars' windows, even the icy patches on the pavement, made me tense, but nothing followed. I kept my speed moderate, careful of the ice, but aware that the highway was empty except for my own solitary vehicle. When I finally reached the lights of the town, the street lamps warm against the cold, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a long time. The house felt impossibly quiet, the normal hum of the refrigerator and furnace not enough to settle the tension in my chest. I tried to explain it to myself, rehearsing the logical answers. Fatigue, icy conditions creating illusions, a strange combination of shadows and headlights. But the clarity of the mirrored movements haunted me. The way it copied me perfectly, the exact rhythm of my braking and accelerating, the eerie anticipation of curves and dips. It was unlike anything I had ever seen on a road. I didn't drive that highway at night again for many years. When winter came, I would choose the longer, well-lit routes, even if it added an hour to the trip. Daylight offered comfort I couldn't find after dark, and the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, quiet warning. Occasionally, I would think about the way the image had anticipated me, the sense that I had been watched, observed, mirrored in a way that no other car could have. I never saw it again, and no one I spoke to mentioned anything similar, but the reflection of my own headlights on icy pavement has never felt ordinary. I still drive carefully, but the memory of that highway, frozen and empty, and the mirrored car that seemed to think ahead of me, stays with me more vividly than almost any other experience I've had on the road. Even now, decades later, I remember the pattern of the ice, the stretch of dark road between the pines, the way the headlights cut through the darkness, and the precise movements of something that should not have existed. It was not supernatural, not a ghost or monster, but it carried a weight, a presence that pressed on the edges of rational thought. I learned that some things on the road cannot be explained, that even in clear, logical daylight, the memory of a night like that will never fully leave you. And I understood, in that long, frozen stretch of Montana highway, that the ordinary world can still present moments that feel impossibly wrong, moments that make you question everything you see and everything you trust. I never went back on that stretch after dark. The longer route became routine. I made sure my car was always in good condition, my tires fresh for winter. But every time I drive past ice on the road, or the faint reflection of headlights in a puddle or frost, I feel that same instinctive shiver. It is not fear of danger in the usual sense. It is a profound awareness that for a few minutes, a long stretch of highway in the dead of night reflected not just light, but my own movements perfectly, impossibly, and that the world could suddenly feel completely untrustworthy in ways I could not explain.